Johan, congratulations. Incredible work that you're doing. You've literally become one of the voices of our time. And it feels to me as
Oh,
though you've picked a number of the biggest issues facing the world and you've got a unique way of explaining them the way very few people can. Can you share with me what led you to wanting to write the way that you do?
but that's very nice of you to say that. Thank you. Cheers, Luke. For me, every book I ever write is about. I always start with a mystery that I want to understand for myself. So I'm not an expert, right? I'm a journalist. I was trained in social sciences at Cambridge University, so I've got pretty good training in that stuff. But I don't. I'm not an expert, right? So I started with my first book, Chasing the Scream, is about addiction. We had a lot of addiction in my family. Um, Nothing I was doing was helping. I was really concerned. I wanted to figure out, well, what causes addiction? What can you actually do about it? What actually solves this problem? So I ended up going on this big journey all over the world for my book, Chasing the Scream, trying to figure that out. I think I found some really interesting and important answers on that. My second book, Lost Connections, is about depression and anxiety, right? I'm at the time that I started writing it, I was about to turn 40. And every single year that I've been alive, depression and anxiety had massively increased in Britain, in the US, across the world, actually, particularly badly in Australia for reasons we could talk about if you like. And I want to figure out what's going on. How do we reverse that trend? So I ended up going on this big journey for that. And the book I think we're going to talk about today, Stolen Focus, was really a very basic problem. I could feel that my own attention was getting worse and worse. And I could see this happening to loads of the people around me. In fact, the figures on it are pretty shocking about the level of crisis we're in. The average office worker now focuses on any one task for less than a minute. And for every one kid who was identified with serious attention problems when I was 7 years old, there's now 100 children who've been identified with that problem. And I could feel it happening to me. I was quite ashamed and embarrassed. I thought there must be something wrong with me. And that's when I kind of started realizing, okay, I need to investigate this. I need to figure out what's actually happening here.
Johan, you just said depression, anxiety, particularly challenging in Australia, and the evidence is there to suggest it. What's your theory as to why in what we often call the lucky country down here, we have such an epidemic as we do in the rest of the world, but why particularly in Australia?
It's really interesting. I spent a lot of time in Australia, and I interviewed a lot of experts in Australia. And I absolutely love Australia. It's why I'm so excited to come back in October for this speaking tour. I think the answer is complicated, and we don't totally know. But I think we've got a few hints. So what I learned from my book Lost Connections is that there's scientific evidence for 9 factors that can make depression and anxiety, can cause it or make it much worse. Some of them are in our biology. There are real brain changes that happen when you become depressed that can make it harder to get out. And your genes can make you more sensitive to these problems. But most of the factors that cause depression and anxiety aren't factors in our biology, they're factors in the way we live. And there's one in particular in Australia that's shockingly high, which is loneliness. You know, Already in the Western world, we're the loneliest society there's ever been. There's a study that asks Americans, how many close friends do you have who you could turn to in a crisis? And when they started doing it years ago, the most common answer is 5. Today, the most common answer is none, right?
Mm.
I think the figure before the pandemic was 42% of Americans agreed with the statement, no one knows me well. Like, what is life like when no one knows you well? You have no friends to share your joy or your pain with. And Australia is just off the scale on loneliness for kind of complicated reasons. A lot of the other factors are going on as well. The other factors that I wrote about. So yeah, I think that's a big thing that's going on there.
It's a real tragedy when you think, isn't it, that most people have got not one person in a crisis they can call to support them or someone to turn to, and those numbers are, as you said, alarming, particularly here in Australia. So much of what you write resonates, and you wrote this in Stolen Focus. At the moment, we think we are prosperous if we are working ourselves ragged to buy things, most of which don't even make us happy. We could redefine prosperity to mean having time to spend with our children, or to be in nature, or to sleep, or to dream. Do you think we need to have a look at what success actually means?
Totally. And I feel that conflict in me. The way I began to think about this, Luke, is that so we all know that junk food has taken over our diets and made us physically sick, right? As you can see from my chins, I'm not immune to that, right? I once got a Christmas card from KFC as their best customer. It's not even a joke, and that wasn't even the fried chicken shop I went to the most. Um, but but just like junk food has taken over our diets and made us physically sick, there's this really interesting scientific evidence that a kind of junk values have taken over our minds and made us mentally sick. But for thousands of years, philosophers have said if you think life is about money and status and showing off, you're going to feel like shit, right? It's not an exact quote from Confucius or Schopenhauer, but that's basically what they said, right? But weirdly, nobody had actually scientifically investigated this until an incredible man who I got to interview a lot, named Professor Tim Kasser, who's at Knox College in Illinois, began to really dig into this. And he discovered loads of things. But for the purposes of your question, I think the most important thing he discovered is that the philosophers are right. The more you think life is about money and status and showing off, the kind of values that are just stimulated in you by Instagram and advertising and so much of how we live, the more likely you are to become depressed and anxious by a quite significant amount. And there's lots of reasons why, but one of them is the way I began to think of it is we've been fed a kind of KFC for the soul. We've been trained to look for happiness in all the wrong places. So, at one level, this is totally obvious and banal. Everyone listening knows none of you are going to lie on your deathbed and think about all the likes you got on Instagram and all the shoes you bought, that and all the money in the bank. You're not going to think about that. You're going to think about moments of love and meaning and connection in your life. But as Professor Kasser put it to me, we live in a machine that is designed to get us to neglect what is most important about life, right? More 3-year-old children know what the McDonald's M means than know their own last name. For the moment we're born, we're pumped with these images. You don't feel good, there's an answer to that. Go shopping, display it on Instagram to make people say, OMG, so jealous. Then when you don't feel good, work even harder to buy even more shit you don't need to display even that on Instagram, right? So we're in this kind of ratchet. So yeah, I think we're in a crisis of values, and it's really a kind of spiritual crisis. I'm not a religious person, so I don't mean that as a kind of like God bothering way, but it's a crisis of values. We are taught to value the wrong things. I learned really interestingly there are interesting techniques you can use to profoundly change your values and regain your inner conflict. One of the ways Professor Kasser puts it as well is so everyone is a mixture of two kinds of values. The fancy term for them is intrinsic values and extrinsic values. So imagine you play the piano. If you play the piano in the morning because you love it and it gives you joy, that's what's called an intrinsic reason to play the piano. You're not doing it to get anything out of it, you're just doing it because that's a thing you love to do, right? Okay, now imagine you play the piano not because you love it, but I don't know, because your parents' dream was to be a piano maestro and they're massively pressuring you. Or to post the clips on Instagram to get likes and impress a woman. I don't know, maybe there's some woman out there who's a piano fetishist, right? Loves a pianist. Or you play it, you play the piano in a dive bar that you hate to pay the rent. Those would be what are called extrinsic reasons to play the piano. You're not doing the thing because you love it, you're doing it to get something out of it further down the line. And we're all a mixture of intrinsic and extrinsic values, and you should be, right? You have to be to get through the day, and it's healthy to have both. But what's happened is our lives have become hugely dominated by extrinsic values. They've hugely crowded out intrinsic values. Think about how many times you'll be on a beautiful beach and no one's looking at the beach. They're just fucking taking pictures of it and posting them on Instagram and then sitting there scrolling to see who commented and liked. That'd be a really good example of people being jolted out of intrinsic experience. It's an amazing thing to be on a beach and watch the sunset and into an extrinsic experience. But that's happening to us the whole time. A kind of ego itching powder is being poured over us the whole time that's jolting us out of these intrinsic experiences. So, I think that's just one of obviously many aspects of this, but I think that is the case.
Yeah, it's such a profound thing you say, and look, I laugh and smile at times, but it's tragic, really, when you think about it, because we can all relate to that, can't you? You do sit on a beach now, somewhere beautiful in Hawaii, and you look all around you, and all it is people taking photos of themselves and not enjoying the moment for a second. And I think your terminology again of sort of that junk food for the soul is that yeah, our ultra processed foods killing us at one level, but the same values that you just described are poisoning people in horrific ways. We've got this anxious generation you talk about. Our kids are growing up with more anxiety than we've ever seen before. Are you optimistic at all, Johan? Do you think that there is a way to retrain ourselves? Because do you think we're taking the problem seriously enough?
Well, I'm optimistic for lots of reasons. But one is, it's like all the smoke alarms are going off. You know, when depression and anxiety and addiction and attention problems are so widespread in society, obviously that's awful. It's a distress signal. But as long as we learn to understand that these are signals that something deeper is going wrong, not just like purely biological malfunctions, like a malfunction in a computer program or something, that they mean something, that your pain means something, that it's connected to deeper problems and deeper unmet needs. Once we begin to understand that, these problems can become fuel for actually changing and sorting out these problems. And one of the reasons I'm optimistic, because all my books, all the problems I write about, I'm not, I don't write my books because I think of this as like, oh, it's an interesting intellectual problem, right? I mean, I'm interested in understanding the problem. But the reason I'm interested in understanding the problem is because if you understand the problem differently, you get to different solutions, right? And there was a moment this really fell into place for me. I was interviewing this amazing South African psychiatrist called Dr. Derek Summerfield. And he told me this story. So he happened to be in Cambodia in Southeast Asia in 2001, I think it was, when they first introduced chemical antidepressants for people in that country. They'd never had them in Cambodia before. He was with the doctors and they said to him, "What are antidepressants?" And he explained. And they said to him, "Oh, we don't need them. We've already got antidepressants." And he was like, "What do you mean?" He thought they were going to talk about some kind of herbal remedy like St. John's wort or ginkgo biloba. Instead, they told him a story. There was a farmer in their community who worked in the rice fields. And one day, um, he got his leg blown off by a landmine that was left over from the war with the US. So they gave him an artificial leg. They're good at that in Cambodia. And a few months later, he went back to work in the rice fields. But apparently, it's very painful to work underwater when you've got an artificial limb. And I'm obviously guessing it was pretty traumatic to go back and work in the field where he got blown up. The guy started to cry all day. After a while, he refused to get out of bed. He developed what we would call classic depression. The Cambodians said, "Well, that's when we gave him an antidepressant." And Dr. Summerfeld said, "What was it?" They explained that they sat with him. They listened to him. You only had to listen to him for 5 minutes to see why he was so distressed. One of the doctors thought, if we bought this guy a cow, he could become a dairy farmer. He wouldn't be in this position that was screwing him up so much. So they bought him a cow. Within a couple of weeks, his crying stopped. Within a month, his depression was gone. It never came back. They said to Dr. Summerfield, "So you see, doctor, that cow, that was an antidepressant. That's what you mean, right?" Now, if you've been raised to think about depression the way we have, that sounds like a weird joke. I went to my doctor for an antidepressant. She gave me a cow.
No.
But what those Cambodian doctors knew intuitively from this kind of individual unscientific anecdote is what the leading medical body in the whole world, the World Health Organization, has been trying to tell us for years. If you're depressed, if you're anxious, you're not weak, you're not crazy, you're not in the main a machine with broken parts. You're a human being with unmet needs. And what you need is love and practical help to get those deeper needs met. So it's a very different way of thinking about this. Of course, there are biological contributions. Of course, chemical antidepressants can give some relief to some people. Anyone listening, if you're taking them and they're helping you, carry on. But precisely because this problem goes deeper than our biology, our understanding of it and the solutions to it need to go deeper. So, of course, what I began to ask is, well, what's the cow for the things that are screwing us up, right? And also I go through a lot of them in lost connections. But yeah, once you reframe with all these questions, addiction, depression, attention problems, our weight problems, the subjects of my books, when you understand what's causing these problems, it opens up a completely different set of solutions, ones that actually work.
And you do a brilliant job of that, Johan. You lift the lid
Oh,
for
thanks.
people and you show them, yeah, our focus didn't just disappear. The fact that it's stolen focus is the title of one of your books, meaning it's not the fault of the individual. You give some great stats that people touch their phone 2,167 times a day. It's an actual stat that you give us. You mentioned earlier the average office worker can now focus on a task for maybe 1 minute at a time. Our kids' attention spans have been obliterated, really. Do you think that helps people understanding that a lot of these things are actually factors out of their control?
So I would put it slightly differently. I think you've raised that really well. It's not that they're out of your control. is that when we reframe them, we have to understand where our control lies. So, to be honest, I'd had my I'd felt my attention was getting worse for a long time. I was really worried about some of the young people that I love. And I had a particularly disturbing experience with one of them that I can tell you about in Graceland. But to be honest, I put off investigating this for a long time, this subject, because I thought the reason my attention was getting worse was obvious. I thought, well, you're just not strong enough. You're lacking willpower. You're weak. You should have the strength to resist these temptations. So I thought maybe I'm just getting older. Maybe it's just that someone invented the smartphone that fucked me over. I was very self-critical, self-blaming. But actually, for stolen focus, which, as you know, I'm coming to loads of Australian cities to talk about soon. I went on this big journey all over the world, from Moscow to Miami to Melbourne, your hometown, not just to cities that begin with the letter M. And I interviewed over 200 of the leading experts on attention and focus. And what I learned is, in fact, there's scientific evidence for 12 factors that can make your attention better or can make it worse. And loads of the factors that can make your attention worse have been hugely rising in recent years. So if you're struggling to focus and pay attention, if your kids are struggling to focus and pay attention, there's nothing wrong with you and there's nothing wrong with them, but there is something wrong with the way we're living. And once you understand what these 12 factors are, you actually begin to regain your power. There's sort of two levels at which you can regain your power. There are individual change. The way I think of it is defense and offense. There are loads of things that you can do immediately to defend yourself and your children against these factors that are harming our attention. I go through loads of them in the book. I'm sure we can talk about them. And then there's also offense. Because the truth is, and I want to really level with people, because I don't feel most people communicating about attention are leveling with people.
Mm.
I'm passionately in favor of these individual changes. I'm sure we can talk about them. I love them. I do them myself. They've massively improved my life. They'll massively improve yours. On their own, they won't fully solve this problem, because the truth is, this didn't happen because you and me had bad habits or our kids had bad habits. This happened because some really big forces fucked with us for very clear reasons. And at some level and at some point, we have to take on those forces that are doing this to us, right? Um, and I went to places that have begun to do that, from France to New Zealand, and I saw how it's begun. So I think when you understand the problem, it's not a problem located in you. I mean, you can have failings as well, like we all do, but that's not why this crisis suddenly blew up in our lifetimes, right? Because we suddenly all got bad habits. Once you understand what's causing the problem, you can begin to actually locate where your power really lies, which to some degree is in defensive measures as individuals and families, and to some degree is us banding together as societies and taking on these bigger forces.
Yeah, and I speak to a lot of people in this format who have really, really powerful habits, and they can articulate them and identify them really clearly. And often there's patterns in them. Most of them have a really clear exercise routine. Most of them have some form of mindfulness practice, whatever that shows up for, like for them. They've got organizational skills. They have a great understanding of sleep. There's consistent patterns. For parents listening, I think for most of us as parents, I think that's where the emotion kicks in. We're fighting with our kids on a daily basis, trying to get them off their smartphones, trying to get them to live a healthier life. What would you say to parents listening to this? What are the places where you would start to try and support our kids to live a healthier and more focused life?
It's such an important question. It's something I think about a lot about the young people that I love. I would start by saying why it matters, because I think we can see it more easily in our kids than we can see in ourselves. I would just say to anyone listening, think about anything you've ever achieved in your life that you're proud of, whether it's starting a business, being a good parent, learning to play the guitar, whatever it is. That thing that you're proud of required a huge amount of sustained focus and attention. And the evidence is clear that when your ability to focus and pay attention breaks down, your ability to achieve your goals diminishes. Your ability to solve your problems diminishes. You feel worse about yourself because you actually are significantly less competent when you can't pay attention. Attention is our superpower as a species. At the moment, we're surrounded by kryptonite, to extend this analogy probably too far. But when you get your attention back, it's a feeling of regaining your competence. And we can particularly worry about this with our kids, because we can see if your kids can't pay attention, they're going to die. They'll be okay, but they're never going to be what they could have been if they could have paid attention, right? think about it in every domain. Like we're speaking just after the Olympics, it's during the Paralympics. I was just watching them before we spoke with my godsons. Think about the incredible amount of achievement that goes in. Like that achievement comes from unbelievably hard and sustained focus over really long periods of time, right? That's true of all achievement, right? You can't pay attention, you're going to achieve much less in your life. So, in terms of how we have that conversation, obviously, this conversation I have all the time with my nephews, my godsons, my niece. What absolutely does not work, and I really urge people, and I understand the temptation to do it, and I've made this mistake myself, so I'm not judging anyone who's done it, is standing over them saying, there's something wrong with you, right? Because there's nothing wrong with them. There's something wrong with the environment we've allowed to be built for them. So I never approach them in a spirit of, hey, listen, Sonny, I've got to tell you what's wrong with you, right? I always frame it as that we're in a shared struggle here. I've got this problem, you've got this problem. And we all have that conflict where we're drawn to massive amounts of distraction. And by the way, we want some of these distractions in our lives. I'm not saying we should all go and live in a monastery, right? I want this to be part of our lives. We just don't want it to dominate our lives in the way that it currently does. So you start from a position of we've got a shared problem here. What do you like about this stuff? What don't you like about this stuff? Okay, how can we keep some of the stuff you like without all this stuff you don't like? And then how can we build from there? So in terms of advice I would give to parents, I would start, there's loads of things, and we can go through many layers to this, but I would just start with one personal thing, and then we can go to bigger stuff if you want. But I would say, start with, you can see I'm holding up to the camera here. I feel like a QVC person here. I promise I have no stocks in this company. I should have fucking bought some before my book came out because their stocks have gone up. So this is something, I'm holding up something called a K-safe. As you can see, it's a plastic safe. Go online, it's about $100 in Australian money. You take off the lid, you put in your phone, you put on the lid, you turn this dial at the top, and it'll lock your phone away for however long you tell it to, between 5 minutes and a whole day. You push that button, it locks, you can't get your phone out, right? I use that for 3 hours a day to do my writing. If I didn't, I would have finished none of my books. I would recommend, if you've got kids, get a K-safe and just start with 15 minutes a day where you all put your phones in the K-safe and have to like look into each other's eyes, like in ye olden times. And it'll be really hard at first, right? But the thing about attention is having someone actually listen to you and you actually listening to them is so much more rewarding than whatever shitty update on Instagram you're going to have to wait 15 minutes for, right? But you start small, you build up those muscles. Now I can talk about lots of other, that's just one of dozens of things I would say to parents. But I would start with that. I would say install on your phone and your kid's phone an app called Freedom. Do this with them, don't impose it on them. An app called Freedom. Freedom can block you either from specific websites. Let's say you're addicted to Instagram or eBay or TikTok or Pornhub, whatever it might be. You can say, don't let me go on that specific website for the next 5 minutes, the next whole day. In fact, you should actually block porn sites, even if your kids want them. But with the other stuff, negotiate with them. But you can say for 5 minutes, for a whole day, you can say, give me an hour's window once a day. And then if you try to go on it, it just says you have been set free and you can't get on it, right? So I have social media permanently blocked on all my devices because I just don't want people to say at my funeral, yeah, Johan spent a lot of time on Twitter. I just do not want that to be the life I had, right? But your life is the sum total of the habits you had in that life, right? And there's no use saying I'm the kind of person who reads books and runs on the beach if hour by hour you're spending your life scrolling through TikTok, right? If you're the guy who spends your life scrolling through TikTok, how you spend your hours is how you spend your life, right? So yeah, I mean, I could say many, many more things, but that's where I would begin the conversation, and then there's lots of other things I would talk about.
Yeah, and you've touched on that a few times. The regret of the dying, isn't it? I wish I loved and connected more and worked and strived less, or as it turns out, maybe scrolled through my phone less. And I love some of the practical things you described there. I did want to move on to your latest book, Magic Pill, because it's such an important conversation to have. And I thought I'd just give a little scene setter for those that maybe haven't had a chance to read. I'd encourage you to do it because this is going to be the conversation of our times. In January 2023, you started to inject yourself once a week with Ozempic, one of the new drugs that produces significant weight loss. And you're far from alone. There's some predictions that you talk about where potentially 1 in 4 in the UK and the global population going forward will be taking a version of one of these Ozempic type drugs. You say that 80% of diets fail, but someone taking one of these new weight loss drugs can expect to lose a quarter of their body weight in 6 months' time. The drugs defenders will say this is a moment of liberation from a condition that massively increases your chance of diabetes and cancer and early death. But I still understand you still feel really conflicted about these Ozempic style drugs. Do they really work as well as they sound? Are they a magic solution or a bit of a magic illusion you write about? You found that the drugs, alongside the massive benefits, also have 12 significant potential risks that you write about. I just wanted to ask you, can you tell us a bit about your own personal journey with taking Ozempic?
Yeah, I remember so vividly the first time I learned about their existence. Um, it was that moment when the world was reopening again at the end of 2022. And I got invited to a party for the first time in ages because no one had had any parties because the whole world was shut down. And I thought, oh, yeah, I remember them. Okay, I'll go. And I was in an Uber on the way there. This party, I'm not saying this just to name drop, it's relevant. This party was thrown by an Oscar winning actor. And I was in an Uber on the way there. And I was feeling a bit kind of self conscious because I was quite fat when the pandemic started and I gained quite a lot of weight during the pandemic. I thought, oh, it's a bit embarrassing. And then I thought, oh, wait a minute. Actually, loads of people I know gained weight during the pandemic. This party's going to be really interesting. I'm going to see all these Hollywood stars with a bit of like podge on them. This is going to be fascinating. And I arrived and I started walking around, and it was the weirdest thing. It's not just that they hadn't gained weight, everyone was like gaunt. Like everyone was like markedly thinner. And not just the stars, but like people I'd known before, their agents, the screenwriters' kids. Like I was like, whoa. And I bumped into a friend of mine on the dance floor, and I said to her, wow, it looks like everyone really did take up Pilates during lockdown. And she laughed. I didn't know why she was laughing. And she said, right, well, you know this isn't Pilates, right? And she showed me a photograph of an Ozempic pen. And I then learned in the next few days that, and obviously spent a lot of time researching this for the book, there's been a staggering medical breakthrough. Sometimes I've seen in the Australian press, this is still being referred to as if it was like a fad or, a diet craze. It's really important people understand. There are lots of things to be worried about here, but this is not a fad. For the first time, we have a drug that means the average person who takes it loses about a quarter of their body weight within a year. It is staggering. And it's not a diet drug in the conventional sense. It radically dials down your hunger. I can explain how. And I remember as soon as I learned about this, I felt two completely conflicting things. The first thing I thought was, well, this could save my life. Because I was about to turn 44, which is the age my grandfather was when he died of a heart attack. Loads of the men in my family get fat and die of heart attacks. My dad had terrible heart problems. They didn't die of them. My uncle died of a heart attack. As I said, my granddad died of it. And I thought, well, I knew then that obviously obesity makes heart disease much more likely. It actually makes over 200 known diseases or complications. It either causes them or makes them much worse. So I thought, wow, if we've got a drug that can reverse obesity, that's a big deal. But I also thought, oh, wait a minute, this sounds way too good to be true. What, effortless weight loss? Come on now. So for the book, I went on this big journey all over the world, from Iceland to Minneapolis to Japan, to interview the leading experts, um, the biggest defenders, the biggest critics of the drug, to dig into how we got to this point as a society where so many people want to take these drugs, what the alternatives to these drugs are. And what I learned is there's a lot to be worried about here. There's some really big risks, but there are staggering benefits to these drugs. Um, yeah, so it's a complicated picture, but people should be really excited. For people with obesity, this is a staggering game changer. There's a lot to worry about as well, but there's a lot to be excited about.
Yeah, I want to touch on that because at the end of your book, you still say you can't be in favour or against Ozempic because you outline 12 potential side effects. And, fascinating to hear you say now that for people with obesity, we know that the life expectancy and the issues are complicated. But you talk about in the book about diminished muscle mass, fears about the prevalence of the increase in eating disorders. Can I ask you this question then? What scares you the most about these Ozempic style drugs?
The way I would put it is these drugs are an unbelievably powerful tool, this is a slightly over the top, but only a little bit. The way I think of them is a bit like fire. Fire is a really incredible tool. It's a great tool if I use it to warm my house up. It's a pretty shitty tool if I use it to burn your house down, right? And when you get an incredibly powerful new tool, it will obviously have great strengths and great drawbacks, right? So we know that if you are, as I was pretty much all my adult life, obese, if you take these drugs and you cease to be obese, as I have, I've gone from being, I'm sorry, I know this doesn't work for Australians, but I was 14 and a half stone. I went down to, I'm a little bit more than 11 stone now. I can never do pounds. I'm sorry, you barbaric colonials will have to do the conversions yourself. And, but that we know that that reduces your risk of heart attack or stroke by 20% in 2 years. Incredible, right? Might well be saving my life. And there are huge benefits like that for health. But there are also some pretty significant risks. In terms of what worries me most, well, there's what worries me for myself, and then there's what worries me for the society, and I'll distinguish them a bit. What worries me most for myself, I've decided to continue taking these drugs because the heart disease risk in my family is so great. And also, frankly, out of vanity. Like, I prefer it now. My neighbour's hot gardener hit on me within 3 months of like taking them. Like, there's loads of great things about not being fat, right? Which are not to do with health. But so I tell myself it's primarily the health benefits. Some of my friends are like, yeah, I can get real. Yeah, health benefits are very nice, but come on, let's level with yourself. But what worries me for myself, there's a few things. One of them is that we don't know the long-term effects of these drugs. So diabetics have been taking them, for people who don't know, in addition to having this incredible effect for weight loss, these drugs also treat type 2 diabetes. They stimulate the creation of insulin. So they've only been used for weight loss for a couple of years, but diabetics have been using them for, it'll be, 19 years now. So they haven't been used for that long. There could be some long-term effect of these drugs that we just don't know about, right? Especially since we know that these drugs work primarily by changing how your brain works. That's pretty sobering, right? But one of the obesity experts I interviewed, a woman in New Orleans, a brilliant woman called Dr. Shauna Levy, who's at the Tulane University School of Medicine. She's an obesity specialist there. She said to me, we don't know the long-term effects of these drugs, but we do know the long-term effects of obesity, and they are catastrophic. So the long-term effects of these drugs would have to be really bad to outweigh the harms of obesity. Obesity makes pretty much everything we fear in medical terms much more common. Dementia, heart disease, stroke, diabetes, cancer. I mean, I was embarrassed to say I was stunned by quite how bad for your obesity is, the evidence about this. So that's my biggest worry for myself. My biggest worry for the society is different. This is not something I think something I'm confident will not happen to me, but I'm really worried about young girls with eating disorders getting hold of these drugs, which has already begun. So I think you've got to distinguish between people who take these drugs who are obese, who take them to come down to be a healthy weight, for which there's a strong case, although there are still significant risks. And then there are people who are already a healthy weight or indeed skinny, who take them to be super skinny. Like, I was on a show recently with one of the Real Housewives of New Jersey, who, that said we're all on it, and they were all already skinny, right? Now, I don't judge anyone for doing that. Women are made to feel like shit about their bodies, whatever they do. So I'm not standing over them wagging my finger. I don't feel that way. But I am worried about that. And I'm, for lots of reasons. You mentioned loss of muscle mass. It can harm you. There's health risks to being super skinny, right? Particularly as you age. But I'm most worried about girls with eating disorders. I'm sure you've known, pretty much everyone has known someone with an eating disorder in their life. Think about anorexia. If you're anorexic, there's a conflict going on inside you. There's the biological part of you that wants to stay alive and therefore wants to eat. And then there's the psychological part of you that, for complicated reasons, wants to starve yourself. And what these drugs can do, if you take them at a high dose, they can just amputate your appetite. They can just cut off that biological part of you that wants to eat. Obviously, you're taking too high a dose if that happens, but that's what they want, right? If you have an eating disorder. And there's already this is happening. Dr. Kimberly Dennis, one of the leading eating disorders experts in the United States said to me that these drugs are rocket fuel for people with eating disorders. So precisely because these drugs haven't arrived in huge numbers in Australia yet, except for people with diabetes, um, I would really urge Australia can get this right in a way that Britain and the US have not so far. These drugs, I absolutely believe, should be prescribed. More importantly, the world's doctors and medical authorities think that. It doesn't really matter what I think. But they should be prescribed very tightly. So at the moment, right, I can look at you. You absolutely do not qualify for these drugs, right? You do not meet the criteria. You are obviously not obese. I guarantee you could get an appointment with a doctor on Zoom and pretend to be in Britain, get an appointment with a doctor on Zoom or pretend to be in Vegas or anywhere in the US, and you would get them delivered to an address in Britain or the US that day, right? We need to do not allow them to be prescribed on Zoom in Australia, right? You should have to go to a doctor. The doctor should weigh you and make sure you meet the medical criteria, or you have type 2 diabetes. If you don't meet the medical criteria, they shouldn't give it to you. And if you're trying to get it and you're too skinny, they should be referring you for eating disorders counseling and help, right? So I worry that in addition to the massive benefits for people like me, and there will be many people in the world whose lives are saved by these drugs, being no doubt about that, and whose lives are massively enriched by it, the statistics that are emerging are staggering for the health benefits. I worry if we don't fix the regulation, there will also be an opioid-like death toll of young girls, and for complicated reasons, eating disorders mostly affect young girls. Obviously, sometimes boys, sometimes older women, but it's overwhelmingly young girls. There'll just be a massive death toll of young girls who would not have been able to starve themselves to death without these drugs, but who will successfully starve themselves to death with these drugs. So yeah, and that's just one of the 12 drawbacks in addition to the benefits that I write about in the book. I'm not normally on the one hand, on the other hand kind of person, but these drugs are so powerful that the effects are complicated and we've got to level with people. The book is called Magic Pill because there's 3 ways these drugs can be magic, right? The first way is they could just solve the problem of obesity. And I've got to level with you, Luke. There are days when it feels like that. My whole adult life, I've been obese. Now I inject myself in the leg once a week, barely even feel it, tiny little scratch with an EpiPen. I'm not fat anymore, right? It's mad. I don't feel hungry very much. I don't overeat. So it could be magic like that. The second way it could be magic is more disturbing. It could be like a magic trick. It could be like a magician who shows you a card trick while they pick your pocket. It could be that over time, the 12 risks associated with these drugs outweigh the benefits. I don't think that's the most likely scenario, but you definitely can't rule it out. The third way it could be magic is I actually think the most likely. Think about all the stories of magic that we grew up with, like think about Aladdin. You find the lamp, you rub it, the genie appears, the genie grants your wish. And it comes true, but never quite in the way you expected. It has all these unpredictable effects. I mean, we're already seeing incredible, unpredictable rippling effects throughout the economy in the US, where now half the population want to take these drugs. So yeah, I think it's most likely to be magic in that third way. It's going to be unpredictable.
Yeah, and for anyone that's considering it, you need to read Magic Pill because the brilliance of Johann Hari is you go and
Oh,
speak to the best experts in the world, and there is no judgment in your writing. You just present the facts as you hear them and see them, and it's a complex one. This one, as you said, 3-year-olds understand the McDonald's symbol before their own surname. Often, we're filling the advertising world with these ultra processed ads for McDonald's and fast food chains. And then at the other end now, we're saying, here's a drug we can inject yourself in the leg to stop you from eating those same foods that we're saturating the environment with. It's a complex time, isn't it, for young people?
it's
And
so interesting you say that, Luke, because actually, when I was thinking about that whole thing you're talking about, there's a really interesting moment in the history of Australia that I think helps us to think about this. So on the one hand, you look at this and go, this is fucking crazy. How did we get to the point where half of Americans want to inject themselves with a drug to stop themselves eating? Like, that just seems so bizarre. How did we reach this point? And I would just say to everyone, just stop listening to this podcast for a second and Google something for me. Google, I found it online. When your prime minister drowned in, I think it was 1966, Harold Holt. So I'm sure people remember, but he disappeared off a beach and was never found. Just Google the beach, video of the beach that day. There's news footage of it. So loads of ordinary Australians were just at the beach. They looked for him. And you look at this beach, just look at the people on that beach for a minute and then come back, right? It's really weird. Everyone on the beach that day looks to us to be skinny or ripped. Everyone. You look at it and go, huh, where was everyone else on the beach that day? Right? Was it like a skinny person convention that Harold Holt was attending? And then you look at the figures for Australia. That's what people looked like in 1966. There were almost literally no fat people in Australia in 1966. So in the year I was born, 1979, 6% of British people were obese. Now it's 27% and rising rapidly, right? Um, Between the year I was born and the year I turned 21, obesity doubled. And then in the next 20 years, severe obesity doubled again. This is really strange. Human beings exist in our modern form for about 350,000 years, between 300 and 350,000 years. And obesity happened sometimes, but it was unbelievably rare. And then literally, I think we're probably about the same age, Luke. In your lifetime and my lifetime, it has blown the fuck up. Why? We know why. This happens everywhere that makes one change. It's where people go from mostly eating a diet of fresh whole foods they prepare on the day to mostly eating a diet of processed and ultra processed foods, which means foods that are built in factories out of chemicals in a process that isn't actually even called cooking, it's called manufacturing food. And it turns out that new kind of food, which never existed before, your great grandparents never had one mouthful of it, nor did mine, nor did anyone listening, unless you're very young. That new kind of food affects our bodies in very different ways to the old kind of food. And I go through lots of reasons why in Magic Pill, but there's an experiment that to me really nailed it, done by a guy I interviewed called Dr. Paul Kenny. He's the head of neuroscience at Mount Sinai, great scientist. It's a super simple experiment. You can all try this at home if you're feeling a little bit sadistic. He got a load of rats and he raised them in a cage. And all they had to eat was the kind of natural whole foods that rats evolved to eat over thousands of years. And when that's all they had, the rats would eat when they were hungry and stop when they were full. They never overate. They never became fat. Then Dr. Kenny introduced them to the kind of modern American diet that's spreading all over the world, almost all the world. He fried up a load of bacon. He bought a load of Snickers bars. Crucially, he bought a load of cheesecake. And he put it in the cage. And the rats went apeshit for the American diet. Actually, I don't know if rats can go apeshit. The rats went crazy for the American diet. They literally would dive into the cheesecake and eat their way out and just emerge completely slicked with cheesecake. They ate and ate and ate and ate. The way Dr. Kenny put it to me is within a couple of days, they were different animals. And within a few weeks, they were all severely obese. Then Dr. Kenny tweaked the experiment again in a way that feels a bit cruel to me. He took away the American diet and left them with nothing but the healthy food. And he was sure he knew what would happen. He thought they would eat more calories than they had before. And this would prove that exposure to the American diet expands the number of calories you eat in a day. That is not what happened. What happened was much weirder. Once they'd had the American diet and they stopped, they refused to eat anything at all. It was like they no longer recognized healthy food as food. They literally only went back to eating healthy food when they were actually starving to death, right? Now, to me, I've nicknamed that experiment Cheesecake Park. I would argue we are all living in a version of that experiment. We're all living in Cheesecake Park. Processed and ultra processed foods undermine your ability to feel full and to get the signal from your body, hey, stop eating now, you've had enough. And what these drugs do is they give you back that feeling of fullness. I actually realized when I started taking Ozempic, I had never really felt full in my life. I'd felt stuffed. I felt so stuffed I couldn't eat anymore, but I'd never felt full, not in the way I do now. But obviously that comes at a cost, right? So obviously the deeper solution is let's not fuck up our kids by feeding them this shit. Now, again, that's not something that you, as we can see, because I went to Japan where they don't allow that to be done to their kids, and there is literally no childhood obesity in Japan. It's a statistically negligible amount. It's a very weird thing to walk around a school of 1,000 children and there be not one single fat child in that school. It's bizarre, right? I talk about how Japan achieved that in the book, but we should follow Japan's lead. But for someone like me, it's too late for that, right? Like, I would love to wind the clock back to my childhood and do that, but I can't do that, right? So I face this difficult choice, but we should not tolerate that being the choice forever. We can solve the problem at root. You have to take on the food industry. You have to take on all sorts of factors. You have to do what Japan has done, but we can do that. Japan is not a fictional country. Can feel like it a bit at times, but it's not. So yeah, we've got to solve the deeper problem. But in the meantime, we face a difficult choice, right? And some people go, well, I thought this myself. Am I being hypocritical taking the drugs? Because I talk all the time about how we've got to solve these deeper problems. So is it hypocrisy? But the way I began to think about it is, I spend a lot of my time in the US. I'm passionately in favour of gun control, partly because of the lesson we have in Australia. You haven't had any massacres since the Port Arthur massacre because of what John Howard did and the Australian people supported. I'm in favour of gun control. Someone I know was murdered in a 7-Eleven in Vegas in gun violence. I'm passionately in favour of gun control, but if I had been there when my friend Tommy was shot, I would not have stood over him and said, well, guys, we've got to close the gun show loophole and we've got to ban bump stocks and we've got to... No, I would have phoned an ambulance, right? Like, in the same way, of course, we should deal with the deeper factors driving up the obesity crisis. But if you're someone who's already been fucked by the fact we're in this situation, I'm not going to stand over you, wag my finger and say, well, we've got to deal with the deeper social factors. I'm going to say, yeah, let's make sure we all live to fight another day. And then we can deal with the deeper social factors. I can't deal with the deeper social factors if I die of a heart attack, right?
Yeah, brilliantly said, and you articulate that in a really fair and unique way. I have to go back and comment on Harold Holt briefly. I'm sitting about 45 minutes from that beach, and I
Right.
have looked at that vision before, and it is stark to see how different. 1966 in a classic Australian way. Only Australians can then name swimming pools after a
Love
former
it.
prime minister who's
Makes me so
drowned,
happy.
and the Harold Holt pool is about 10 minutes from where I'm
Genius.
sitting. It's just classic
It's one of the
Australian thing to
many
do.
one of the many things I love about Australia. If I was to say to someone you wanted to distill the Australian spirit into one thing, I wouldn't show them Uluru, I wouldn't show them a fucking koala. Here's the Harold Holt swimming pool. Huh, why is it called that? Because their prime minister fucking drowned. It'd be like having a JFK shooting range or something. Like, what are you doing? Love
It's
it.
so Australian, and the fact that you can disappear off that beach and never be seen again is still one of the great bizarre
Yeah.
mysteries of life. I love this saying, Johan, that success leaves clues, and I'm curious to fire a few questions your way and just
Sure.
around what successful people like you, and you've had an incredible, fascinating, interesting life, and this idea of self-leadership. You've overcome your own fair share of challenges in your life. When you read about your history before becoming this incredible, successful and trusted author, you battled your own addiction, which you're incredibly open about, and you resigned from your dream job as a columnist, and you had some public challenges with that. And we know it's incredibly hard to lead other people and do what you're doing without an understanding of yourself. How would you describe the way that you lead yourself now?
I pursue things that I find incredibly meaningful. So for me, when you get knocked off course, as we all do, you face challenges, you face drawbacks. Every book I ever write, very early on in writing it, I write on top of a bit of paper, why does this matter? And I write a list of reasons why it matters, why I'm doing it, why is it important? And then when I have moments of, writing, I don't like it when writers go, oh, writing is so hard, right? My grandmother left school when she was 13. She spent her whole fucking life cleaning toilets. I would not go back in time and say to my grandmother, God, my life's so hard, right? Like, I think when writers say that, I say, get a fucking grip, mate. Go look at how the rest of the world lives. Yeah, there are challenges in our job, but, we're really fucking lucky. But so with that caveat, when my job is hard, I re-anchor myself around meaning, right? Meaning gets you through a lot. I interviewed a really amazing Russian psychologist in Moscow. He said to me once, Russians, when we look at Anglo-American philosophy and psychology, we just laugh because you talk all the time about, oh, you know, life is about pursuing happiness. It's even there in is it the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution? I forget the Declaration of Independence. It's like this is just to us. This is a joke. Happiness will come and go, and you have very little control over it. Life isn't about pursuing happiness. Life is about pursuing meaning. And when you've got meaning, you can absorb a huge amount of pain. Just think about, this is a trivial example, but I went to the dentist last week, right? It's fucking agony. But because that pain happened in the context of a system of meaning, the dentist said, I'm going to inflict terrible pain on you, but it's so that you don't feel more pain in the future and so that your teeth look nice and you're not fucked up. Actually, I was able to endure that pain pretty easily. Now, if someone broke into my house now and stuck a drill into my mouth for no reason, that would literally be torture. I would be like traumatized for years, right? So you see the difference is, what's the difference between the two? So only one thing, which is the system of meaning surrounding it. So if you have a system of meaning, you will be able to absorb a lot, right? So for me, I think one of the ways I sort of lead myself is I work on things that are very meaningful to me, and I anchor myself in that meaning, and I systematically remind myself of the meaning of what I'm doing. Yeah, that's the thing that most comes to mind.
Yeah, Johan, and then the next sort of dimension I want to talk to you about is that impact. I mean, you've had a global impact on the way people think and given people practical advice and um, really important information in ways they haven't had before on things that are incredibly challenging for those of us living in the modern world. What's your advice on how people can impact the way that you've been able to go about other people or to be able to lead the teams of people that they're in? You write books and it's a bit of a solo pursuit that you're in, but do you think about that impact that you have on others in the work that you do?
I do think about it. It wouldn't be honest. It wouldn't be honest if I said I didn't. I was told something in the zoo in Sydney once. I don't know if this is actually true. I've always meant to look it up. So the person told me, you might know, person told me, um, koalas, obviously the only thing they eat is eucalyptus leaves, but they're so thick that if the eucalyptus leaves are not above them, they don't recognize it as food. So the person said to me that a koala would starve to death in a room full of eucalyptus leaves if they were just on the floor. I don't know if that's actually true. I've meant to look it up. But the reason I mention that is because I think, in a way, a lot of us are a bit like those koalas. Um, so the thing that drives me forward most is curiosity. I'm really curious about other people. I like almost everyone I actually meet, and everyone you meet, you just think every single person you ever meet knows stuff you don't know, and they've had a life you haven't had. And if you can tap into that, if you can just be curious about people and develop skills to kind of help people talk about themselves, the world is like infinitely abundant. You're just surrounded by riches. But I think a lot of us, because we're in this culture, again, it's not our fault, encourages us to be narcissistic, to think about ourselves, to be kind of sealed off in our own egos. We're a bit like this hypothetical koala that's in a room full of eucalyptus leaves but just doesn't even recognize it and is starving to death, right? Um, so I think the more you can be genuinely curious, maybe I think some people think that leadership is standing above people and directing them, right? And of course, there'll be times when leaders have to be like that, right? You general on a battlefield is not conducting an open seminar the whole time, right? But the more you can be driven by curiosity, the more you genuinely listen to people. I think firstly, just the smarter you'll be. Like you learn stuff from everyone, right? But also, the more people will lean into you, particularly in a very narcissistic age, when actually very few people feel listened to, very few people are listened to. Um, I think the core of the answer to what I'm not quite getting at it, but the the reason I think I'm effective insofar as I am is because I'm genuinely curious about these questions, and that means that I'm also eager, once I've learned it, to communicate it to other people, right? So I think a lot about how to communicate with people. I don't talk in an, and also partly, I'm from a working class family. My dad was a bus driver, my mum was a nurse, and then worked in shelters for victims of domestic violence. I was mostly raised by my grandmother because my mother was ill. My dad was in a different country, so mostly raised by my grandmother, who, like I say, left school when she was 13, was a fucking amazing person. So I want to communicate with the widest possible range of people, and I would always want to write a book that my grandmother could have read, right? So I'm not trying to. A lot of people think kind of, well, the wanky term, even I even hate to use it, but like thought leadership. A lot of people think thought leadership is making things complicated. You don't want to simplify things, but at all. But real intelligence comes from making complicated things comprehensible, not from making simple things incomprehensible, which is how many people seem to think of it.
Which is the genius of your writing for me, is that you take these complex issues and you write them in a way that we can understand that
Oh, thank
very
you.
very few can. I want to pick up on that curiosity because like you strike me as one of the most curious people I've ever had the pleasure of speaking to you. Could you give an example of a rabbit hole you've gone down recently where that curiosity just takes you into a different direction?
Well, the last 15 years, I've been investigating a series of crimes that have been happening in Las Vegas. My publishers will taser me if I talk about it too much, but
Is that the next book? Is that
yeah. And I've been working on it a really long time. It's a really strange story, but
And so on that, without giving away, and which you won't with the book to come out, is it just a story that takes you, and that's enough to send you on a mission to uncover more? I mean, so it feels like a very different genre for you to go down. It's just curiosity's got you, and you want to tell this story.
I learned that there were people living in the drainage tunnels beneath Las Vegas. So I went there in 2011 and I met this amazing couple I really kind of fell in love with who were living there. And they brought me into this world. And then we discovered some really strange things were happening in that world. And I kept going back. It was curiosity, it was concern for them, it was something in myself. Vegas attracts people who have a wound and don't quite know what it is. That's a very pretentious thing to say, but I do think it's true. Benny Binion, who was one of the kind of iconic casino owners of Vegas, said, "If you have a weakness, Las Vegas will find it." That's been a bizarre rabbit hole for a big part of my life. And there's something about you get a depth of understanding when you work on something for such a long time. Although I did the other day, quite recently, get someone I know who lives in one of the tunnels saying, "Have you still not written your book yet?" And I was like, "Wow, I'm being chided on unproductivity by by one eyed Jay who lives in the tunnel." This is not a good sign, but the yeah.
Amazing. A lot of the stuff you've done is with a big vision, and I'm curious about that. The specific things you've done to bring people along the journey, along the way, to bring these visions to life. Can you share a bit of that? I'm assuming that that doesn't happen by accident.
Well, writing is a kind of unusual one, isn't it? You've got to be heavily self-propelled, right? Um, there are lots of people who are better writers than me, who would be better writers than me, but don't have that internal self-propulsion. And I'd love to tell you that comes from some wonderful place, but I grew up in a very violent and crazy environment. And the way I coped with that was by reading and writing all the time from when I was very young. So if I have a day when I don't read and write, well, that day never comes. But if I did have one, I would start to spin out. So obviously, I've harnessed that to some positive use, But I have had contexts where I worked in teams. Obviously, the film adaptation of my book, I was incredibly lucky, and the documentary adaptation of my book with Samuel L. Jackson was amazing. So I've had plenty of times when I work in teams, and I have, like on the Vegas book, I have an amazing researcher who works with me, who's just unbelievably good at like finding people, tracking things down, figuring out documents and things.
Johann Hari, who's been the greatest leader in your life?
Oh God, there's so many. My grandmother, was a great human being. Two people come to mind. Uh, my friend Dorothy Byrne. So lots of British people will know who I'm talking about. Dorothy is an absolute legend in British television. She was the first woman to run all current affairs and news for a British TV channel, for Channel 4 News in Britain. And she ran it for 20 years. She's one of the wisest people I know. She's one of the funniest people I know. People Google Dorothy Byrne, it's Byrne. She gave something called the McTaggart Lecture in 2019, I think it was, which is like one of the funniest and most brilliant talks you'll ever see. And you get a sense of what an incredible human being Dorothy is. But she's someone we've been friends for, I don't know, 20 years. She's someone I go to for advice a lot. She's got a really interesting style, Dorothy. She's just an incredible human being. She's someone. Another one is someone in Vegas. My friend Paul Vautrinot and my friends Paul and Rob Banghart. Paul and Rob used to live in the tunnels beneath Vegas. They got out. They now run a group which people can donate to online called Shine a Light, where they go back into the tunnels every day. They give out supplies, food, water, sanitary products, um, stuff people need, but also most importantly, they offer people help. So if you want to get out, they help you. They've got hundreds of people out of the tunnels and back to a healthy life. Um, the best people I've ever met. They're amazing people, and they're like a real model of. I think about model of leaders. They're fuck me. Rob and Paul know how to lead, and it's in a funny way like Dorothy. They lead in a very much in a spirit of love and compassion. Dorothy's very much like that, and Dorothy. What I love about Dorothy's style of leadership and Rob and Paul's style of leadership is they're people who are very focused on the people who most need help. Like, I'll give you an example. Dorothy, there was a paedophile in Britain called Sidney Cook, who's one of the worst child abusers in British history. And Sidney Cook was about to be released. And Dorothy went into the news meeting and they're having all this conversation about where's Sidney Cook going to live when he's released and how that's going to be handled. Dorothy said to them, "You're all asking the wrong question. The question isn't where will Sidney Cook live when he's released. The question is, why the fuck is Sidney Cook being released? He's one of the worst paedophiles in British history. Let's find all his other victims who haven't come forward and make sure he never gets out of prison." Right? So she then makes a film about that. He never got out of prison, right? Like, I mean, I could tell you like 100 things like that that Dorothy did and led, right? People will have, lots of Australians will have seen, she made the documentary Leaving Neverland about Michael Jackson. That was her idea. She was one of the producers. She made the recent documentary about Kevin Spacey with my other amazing friend Patrick Strudwick, exposing him. You know, I mean, Dorothy has just fearlessly taken on very powerful people in the interests of powerless or people who don't have much power. And Rob and Paul are the same, always focused on, hard to imagine less powerful people than people literally living in the drains. They are focused every day on, they are rightly as valuable as every other person in Las Vegas. And okay, how do we get them the help they need to live the lives that they deserve to live?
Yeah, brilliant answers. I love asking that question. You know, you went to your grandma, and then these extraordinary people, and that's what fills me with optimism. Is there's great people doing extraordinary things, and for someone like you to shine a light on that as you do is a really powerful thing. We're a bit obsessed with collaboration. We feel like the world had gone into silos, and people, as you described, loneliness is a huge issue, and great things happen when you connect people together in unique ways from different backgrounds. A bit like your answer there, isn't it? Two people living in the drains of Las Vegas. Most of us didn't even know there were drains in Las Vegas, let alone a community living down there, and exceptional producers changing the world. Has there been someone you thought, God, I'd love to collaborate with them on a project or another passion of yours or another area of your life? Is there a name that comes to mind? Clearly, you've had access to interesting people over the journey, but has there been anyone that you've been curious about?
I've been like freakishly and insanely lucky on this front. Like, for my book Stolen Focus, I did this experiment where I went off the internet for 3 months. I had no smartphone, I had no laptop. I went to this place in Cape Cod called Provincetown. It's kind of very up and down experience that I describe in the book. But when I got reunited with my phone, I was for a couple of weeks I didn't listen to all the voicemails, and there was a voicemail. I was going through the unidentified numbers, and I was just deleting them. For most of them were like just spam, whatever you call it. And I almost didn't listen to this one that was an unidentified number, and it said, "Hi Johan, this is Oprah calling. I read your book," and it was this long message from Oprah. And because my friends know how much I fucking love Oprah, right? Like, I know everyone likes Oprah in that way, but like, I mean, I was profoundly shaped by watching the Oprah Winfrey Show every day for years and years and years, right? I'm like an Oprah mega fan, and I thought this is one of my friends taking the piss, right? But I was like, but they've done a really, really good impression of Oprah, right? But at the end of this message, she doesn't. She says, "Well, because your answer machine doesn't have your voice, I'm not sure this is actually your number, so I don't want to leave my number on a random answer machine. So I'll call you back, right?" 3 fucking months passed. I did not get a call back from Oprah. I was like, well, I fucked it, right? I've missed my one chance. Should never have gone off the internet. And then she phoned me one day And I find this slightly surreal to say, but we are friends. I'm going to go and see her in Montecito in a few weeks, and yeah, I mean, and I'm probably the two people I most admire in the world are Noam Chomsky. In fact, probably the three people I most admire, kind of public figures, are Noam Chomsky, Oprah, and Eve Ensler, who a lot of people will know because she wrote the Vagina Monologues, but has done many things. And I'm friends with all of them. So that's been a really bizarre. Like I've cooperated with Chomsky because I was he's sadly not well now, but for many years I've been writing his biography, another long-term project. He's now 95, and I'll probably be older than he is now by the time I finish. So I've been really lucky with all three of them to get to know them well and sort of collaborate with them in various ways. If you had told my 10-year-old self one day well, I wouldn't have known what texting was when I was 10, I guess, but you'll be like texting with Oprah and Chomsky. I would have been like, yeah, and you'll have a device on which you can push a button and someone will deliver KFC to your house. And you'll have a massive television. I would have been like, on which you can watch any film that's ever been made. I would have been like, well, that's it. Like, what you mean? You're telling me is I will live in nirvana, right? My life will be entirely complete, and I will be in a state of constant ecstasy until death, right? So yeah, I've been very, very lucky with that.
What a brilliant note to finish on, and I've thoroughly enjoyed our conversation. I could talk for hours. So curious about the many things that you do, and really excited to see you here in Australia. Hopefully, get to catch up in person. I know you're doing a great tour.
Yeah, come to the Melbourne show. I should say to people, or my publicist will taser me. But yeah, I'm speaking about our attention crisis, why it's happening in Australia, what people can do about it, very practical level, how we can all get our focus back. I'm doing it in Sydney, Melbourne, Perth, Adelaide, Canberra.
We'll put all the dates out on the show notes on this show, and
Great,
hosted by the beautiful Sarah Grimberg, who's a champion,
lovely, Sarah.
who's going to be sensational. And Johan, it's a great contribution that you make every day. We've all been inspired by your work, and
Oh,
real pleasure to speak to you today. Thanks for your time.
thanks so much. Cheers.